Hello, my name is Rachel. I'm a school psychologist working in Maryland, and we're here at School Psych Podcast tonight to talk about stats. A really fun topic for me anyways. I know a lot of people think it's boring, but I'm excited. But I'm going to pass it over to Rebecca, and she's going to tell us a little bit about how you guys can participate tonight. Rebecca?
Yes, hello everyone. I am a school psychologist working in the state of Connecticut, and I'm going to remind you how to participate. You can, if you are watching live right now, you can log into your YouTube account, and once you're signed in, you can comment right alongside the video in the chat box on YouTube. You can also comment if you're watching this recorded later. You can comment under the YouTube video by signing in, and you can comment if you're hearing us in some other way on Twitter using the hashtag #PsychedPodcast, or on the Facebook pages School Psyched, Your School Psychologist, or the School Psych Podcast page. You can comment right on the page under the last post, which was about the podcast, or you can message me. I'll be looking for notifications. And here's Eric.
Hi, everybody. I'm Eric, and I'm a school psychologist in Connecticut as well. And we're excited to have Dr. Beaujean back. And just to remind everybody just a little bit about him, he's an associate professor of psychology at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, and is a prolific scholar. He's published 2 books on latent variable models, more than 80 articles and book chapters in peer-reviewed scientific outlets, and he's presented more than 80 papers, posters at professional conferences. In 2016, he was listed as one of the most prolific faculty members in non-doctoral school psychology programs across the nation, and has won research awards from the American Academy of Health Behavior, American Psychological Association, School Psychology Division, Mensa Education Research Foundation, and Society for Applied Multivariate Research. He presented a wonderful podcast to us back in the spring as well. And so we want to continue that. And one of the things that I thought was just brilliantly funny and impressive was just the notion he mentioned that we've been bamboozled. And I sort of went away with that term and really just got a kick out of it, because there are things that we've been bamboozled about. And we really appreciate Dr. Beaujean's presenting to us. We did a little poll that was kind of fun and funny that was just on the Facebook page, asking people what they want to learn more about. And there were some funny options for us to choose from. But here we are, ready to learn again from Dr. Beaujean, and want to learn more about what we've been bamboozled about and how we can account for variance in the assessments that we give for students.
Well, thank you all for having me back again. I appreciate the opportunity here, and hopefully I can help you all learn something, or y'all can help me learn some stuff as well. Last time when I stopped, I didn't quite get to grade equivalent scores. And so my idea here is I'm going to finish that module up, just so that, I know that's a question that folks have. And then maybe discuss a little bit, the difference between grade equivalent scores and grade norms. Those things sometimes get interchanged, although they're extremely different concepts. And then if there's questions to ask, I'd be happy to do some Q&A. If not, then I have some other things I can talk about as well. So I always, tell my students, they have an opportunity to ask questions, but if they don't, then I assume that means they want me to talk more about what I'm interested in talking about. So I guess we can kind of take the same idea here. So I'm going to share this. All right, there we go. And so the whole idea behind grade equivalent scores is to assess growth. That's the whole reason that they were developed and used. It's to assess change in individuals. So it's really common when we're wanting to not measure things in psychology or the attributes here. Sometimes we just want to know a picture of where an individual is at right now, and we kind of call it a day. Other times you want to know, well, how do they change from time point 1 to time point 2 to time point 3, et cetera. Whether it's from grade 3 to grade 4, or beginning of the intervention, middle of the intervention, end of the intervention. We want to know what the change looks like. And that was kind of the impetus behind grade equivalent scores. If you remember from last time, we talked about norm reference scores and sometimes content reference scores. They both have some difficulty in getting at change. So if you use like IQ scores, T-scores, etc., and you want to measure growth or you want to measure change over some time period, that's difficult to do. So with norm reference scores, they just do not assess change very well. What happens is, if you remember, I talked about last time that the IQ score metric or T scores or whatever units they're on, if they're on a norm reference unit, they're really kind of giving you rank orders or relative positions among an individual's peers. And for many psychological attributes, those tend to be stable over time. So their fluid reasoning or their verbal comprehension, whatever attribute of interest there, those tend to be their rank orders tend to be relatively stable over time. And so when you're looking at those, rank order type scores, you want to see change over time, you're very apt to see that they're relatively stagnant, within a particular instrument. So what for an individual's norm reference score to change over time, what has to happen is that the individual has to change at a faster rate than the norming scale or the norming sample. And that's not unheard of, but it's not, the most common thing to have happen. So if at time point 1, they have an IQ score, of 100, and time point 2, they have a, IQ scale score of 105, it means that they've changed faster than, what it was expected from the norming sample. And so that's not the most common thing to have happen. And so what we need is our other ways to get at growth. From a content reference perspective, those values tend to be qualitative descriptors, and those also aren't usually very good at getting at growth. The reason for that is that you often have to have your raw score or scaled score, whatever, meet a certain threshold before you change categories. So, to go from, below proficiency to proficient, you're typically, there's a range of scores within those qualitative categories. And so someone may actually be growing, but they haven't grown enough to change categories. And so both of those tend to be a little bit problematic when you want to look at change over time. And so that was really the impetus for grade equivalent scores being developed. So what a grade equivalent score is, it's, just defined, it's you're taking a score that already exists, whether it be a raw score, a raw score, what have you there, and you're figuring out what's the grade level, for that particular score. It's usually kind of defined as the median score for a particular grade. Sometimes it can be the mode, or sometimes it can be the, arithmetic mean, but usually it's the median score there. So that's, I got that from John Flanagan. He wrote in, a long time ago about what that is. Unfortunately, if you look up grade equivalent scores on the internet or whatever textbook, you'll see lots and lots of, opinions about them, but there's not a whole lot of materials that are provided about how you actually calculate them. And many of the information from them comes from the Hieronymus and some of the other folks from the Iowa Test of Basic Skills camp. And a lot of those materials just aren't available online. If you have a really diligent interlibrary loan department, they can sometimes get those materials for you. But outside of that, they're just not easy to come by. So I've kind of put together a little bit of stuff here just to kind of give folks an idea about how grade equivalent scores are actually calculated there. So what they do is they estimate some attribute level on a developmental continuum. So whereas norm reference scores just look at how does the individual perform based on his or her same age peers or sometimes same grade peers, but it's a very restricted norm group. Whereas grade equivalent scores look at multiple groups. So it's on a continuum of peers. So you can kind of think of it as having multiple peer groups that you're comparing a given score to. All right. And they were designed as an alternative to the norm reference scores, which, when these came on the scene in the mid 20th century, this was a very nice alternative to using the norm reference score. Just as an example of how you would interpret that, let's say Ariel got a score of 36, and you can tell where, my kids are very much into Disney princesses, so you can see where I get some of these names from. She earned a score of 36, a raw score, and that 36 happens to be the median score of students that are in the 7th month of 4th grade. And so that means that Ariel's grade equivalent score is 4.7. So that's what the 4, that's what the integer component means of those, and then the decimal component. So the integer component means the grade, and then the decimal component means what month of school. And usually they start off with August being, 1st, and then September 2nd, et cetera there. So that's all that, a grade equivalent score actually means. So the general process for calculating or creating them, first you have to administer one instrument or multiple equated instruments to students in the desired grade. So you have to give a common instrument to students in 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade. And if you think about the process of doing that, especially for an achievement test, that's not an easy thing, because what's going to be, in the zone of development for a 3rd grader is going to be way too easy for a typically developing, 5th grader, 6th grader, et cetera. So you have to have content on your instrument that covers a wide variety of grades. Or the alternative is that you have multiple forms for each grade, but then you have some type of linking items so you can link the 3rd grade to the 4th grade to the 5th grade, et cetera. But one way or the other, you have to have some type of instrument that is given to a variety of students in multiple grades. And so whether you administered one instrument or multiple instruments, then you link them, then you have to take the scores from the different students in the different grades, and then you have to put them onto a single scale. Peterson called this an interim scale score, but all this means is that it's a score that's applied to students from every grade. So the 3rd graders, the 4th graders, the 5th graders, 6th graders, they'd all have scores on this particular scale. From the, variety of items that they were administered there. All right. And then that interim scale is largely going to be used to rank order the students, because what you want to do is see, well, how well they performed, not only across the whole, multiple grades, but also within a grade, how well a particular value was there. And so this is an example. You can see here on the left are different grades. And then there in the second column is the median interim score scale. And you can see this comes from, I think, one of the Iowa Test of Basic Skills results, because they're one of the biggest users of the grade equivalent scores today. So you can kind of see that as you go from 3rd grade to 4th grade, there's more, items, or there's higher values on that interim score scale. And you can pretty much think of those, in this case, these are equivalent to raw scores. And so because these were administered in January, these instruments were administered in January, that means that these are the grade equivalent scores of 3.5 or 4.5 or 5.5, because January would be the 5th month. Yeah, I think it's January is the 5th month there. And then to the right of that, you can see the percentile rank. So for the 3rd grade students who took this, about 50% got a score of 12.1 or lower. And then, about 50% of the 4th graders got a score of 15.6 or lower. And then you can, go up into the 8th grade and see that about 50% got a grade of 23.8 or lower on that same interim scale score. So you can look and see within it or between grades what, how folks did. You can also look at, within a particular grade, how well, students, did. So you can see that about 70%, of the students, in the 4th grade, got a score of 12.1 or about 20% of the students got a score of 12.1. There's that. If you look at the last row and then that 4.5 column, that tells you about 70% of the 4th grade students, again in the 5th month here, were able to get that score of 12.1 or higher, got something equivalent there. So 4th grade students tend to do a little bit better than the 3rd grade students. And likewise, you can see that, for 5th grade, about 88% are able to get a score of at least 12.1, on there. So that's how you would look at that particular, table there and see, well, how well are folks doing? And because this is a nationally administered test with lots and lots of support with that, this is going in the direction that you expect it to go, and that as you go to the right, the values tend to get higher, and as you go up, the values tend to get a little bit lower. So if you go in the third 3.5 column and you go start at grade 3, then you go to grade 4, grade 5, grade 6, those are getting lower up there, because you wouldn't expect third graders to get 23.8 items correct, which is the typical performance of an eighth grader. So, but there were some third graders, because that top value is 0.09, it's not 0. So there were some third graders that were able to score about as well as eighth graders, the typical eighth grade performance, or typical eighth grader was able to perform. But they're very few and far between. So this is what a typical first step is here with making the grade equivalent scores. The step 5 then is to calculate is to calculate the values for the intermediate grade levels. And what that means is you're going to look and see, well, we have grades, we have values at the 5th month for 3rd grade, the 5th month for 4th grade, the 5th month for 5th grade, etc. But what happens if we want the 8th month for 3rd grade, or we want the 2nd month for 4th grade? So what we have to do is we have to interpolate what those values are, and you can do that by plotting what the percentiles were for each grade. And then in red here, you see I kind of have linked the values. So on the right, you can see I see the median value of the interim score. So in that red line kind of plots the average value for the different grades. So it starts with the 3rd grade, then the 4th grade, 5th grade, etc. there. And then the black lines give you the the percentiles within a particular grade. So this black line kind of tells you what performance looks like within a grade. The red line tells you what performance looks like between grades. And then you would kind of use this red line to kind of guide you to figure out what would a typical performance be for a 4th grade student in the 8th month, or 5th grade student in the 2nd month. You would just use this kind of red line to interpolate what those values are. So far, there's really nothing terribly, problematic with this. The next step is where the problematic component comes, and that comes with finding values for extramedia or outside grade levels. So if we administered this, in this particular example, we administered the instrument to 3rd graders, 4th graders, 5th graders, 6th graders, 7th grade, 8th graders, but then we want to extrapolate. Well, what would scores be like for 1st graders? What would scores be like for 9th graders? And so that's where the problem, or some of the problems, are, because this test was not actually administered to 2nd graders, it was not actually administered to 1st graders, wasn't administered to 9th graders. Yet we want to extrapolate out to what we expect those scores to be had we administered, the instrument to them. Because for 3rd graders that score really, really low, we want to extrapolate to see what their score, what grade level those scores kind of would map onto. So we would say that, oh, maybe a 3rd grader who performed particularly low has a grade equivalent score of 1.9 or 2.4 or something along those lines. But 1st graders or 2nd graders never were administered this particular instrument, so can be some problems with that. And then the last step is to calculate the grade equivalent values from these scores, and that involves finding using this line, this blue and red line here, to figure out what are the median values for a particular raw score or interim score there across all possible scores that students obtained. So that's the general process of calculating grade equivalent scores. There's nothing really wrong, except maybe the extrapolation can cause some issues. There's not really anything wrong with the grade equivalent scores per se. The problem with them is that they have a really strong propensity for misinterpretation, because they're on that grade, or ostensibly they're on a grade metric. People often misinterpret them as representing information that they don't actually represent. So grade equivalent scores do not tell you where a student should be placed in the grade of a school. So a student gets a grade equivalent score of let's say 6.5 in the fifth month of the sixth grade, it doesn't mean that the student can do work, of a sixth grader. So if a third grader gets a score of 6.5, it does not mean that that third grader can do sixth grade work. So it doesn't tell you where a student should be placed. Likewise, it doesn't tell you if the student has the academic skills for a specific grade. So you can't look and say, oh, look, across all these academic domains, the third grader was getting, fourth grade equivalent, fifth grade equivalent, et cetera. They probably can do fourth grade work or fifth grade work, et cetera. That's not what these instruments tell you. That's not what a grade equivalent score can tell you. If you want to look at accelerating a student, or having them skip upgrade, you need to get different types of information than just looking at grade equivalent scores. So that's where the problem comes with these grade equivalent values, is that not necessarily the scores in and of themselves, but it's their strong propensity for misinterpretation. In fact, the problem got so bad that in the early 1980s, the International Reading Association actually made a resolution to tell standardized, creators of standardized reading tests to abandon the practice of reporting grade equivalent scores. They actually published this in their little journal there, and they made a resolution there. Obviously, it didn't, pick up a whole lot because they're still, in great use today. But you can see how problematic, these can be if a organization is making these resolutions that they should just be completely abandoned. Then they can, be a bit problematic. Now, I don't really have slides here for the grade norms, but grade norms are something that are quite a bit different. Grade norms are they're norm reference scores. So they're very equivalent. They're similar to what I talked about last time, in that, let's say you want a, reading, score, and you want their grade, want to get someone's value on a grade norms. You're going to go through all the same steps that you would with a norm reference score. Only difference is that your norm group isn't going to be based on how old someone is, with chronological age. It's going to be based on what grade they're in. So whereas when you use age as your norming group, you can have, let's say we're going to use 5-year-olds that are about 5 years and 6 months. Within that particular range, you're probably going to have students from multiple grades. There's going to be some students in there that aren't in kindergarten yet, because their parents decided to hold them back for a year. You're going to have some students in there that may be in kindergarten. You got some students there that may possibly be in, first grade if they started off a little bit early there. So within a particular age, you're going to have multiple grades. So if you look at the grade norms for a particular grade, so let's say, kindergarten, the fourth or fifth month, there, you're going to have students with multiple ages. So if you're going to take a, kindergarten, mid-year, you're going to have some students that are 5 years old. You're going to have some students that are 6 years old. So you're going to have a variety of ages within a particular grade. So what all that grade norms do is they look and see how well, if you take a raw score and you compare it to same age peers, but same age peers in this case are folks that are of the same grade. So, it'd be all kindergarten students in their 5th month or what have you there. And those are entirely separate from grade equivalent scores. So go ahead.
Question. So when we're dealing with, grade norms, so achievement tests that give you can run the norms through age or grade, thinking about the Woodcock-Johnson or the Wyatt. Is there a best practice? Should we be using one or the other, or it just depends on the referral concerns? I see a lot of people that just say, well, I just use age because that's what I've been taught. And so I was just wondering the reasoning. How do you know what to pick, I guess?
They give you different pieces of information, just like percentiles give you different pieces of information than, if you look on the Woodcock-Johnson, they give you like the RPI, they give you the percentiles, they'll give you, a variety of different scores. So there's not one that's necessarily better than the other. They just give you different pieces of information. So grade equivalents are going to tell you, what does a typical student in that particular grade, what are they able to do? Whereas age, norms are going to tell you what's a student of that particular age typically able to do. So if you're looking at age norms, you have to realize that there are students in multiple grades in that same age group. So, you may have, for a 5-year-old, 6th, 7th month, you may have some that are, preschool. You may have some that are in kindergarten. So for a given age, you're going to have students across multiple grades. For grade norms, for a given grade, a group. So let's say, kindergarten, 5th month, 6th month, et cetera, you're going to have students of multiple ages. So, my kids are in kindergarten now, and they have students in there that turned 5, before, almost a year ago. And so they're, 6 plus. Then you have students that just turned 5, maybe in June or July. So there's almost like a year's difference in age, but they're in the exact same grade. Okay. So with grade norms, the issue is that, if you condition on a particular grade, you're going to have a variety of ages within there. So they just tell you different pieces of information, and they have different pros and cons with them. So I wouldn't say that necessarily one is better than the other. They just give you different pieces of information.
What about in cases with retention? I'm thinking that grade would in some situations be more appropriate if the student hasn't been exposed to, 3rd grade curriculum and whatnot, because they were retained in 1st grade. So it would make more sense to me that I probably don't want to compare them to, does that make sense? Or again, they're giving you different pieces of information. If you select on a particular age, you're going to have people from multiple grades. Likewise, if you select on a particular grade, you have people from multiple ages in there. And so even if a student is retained, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no one else in that particular age group or no one else in that particular grade group that's the same as that particular student. Because if you look at nationally, if you condition on, 1st grade, 1st month, or what have you, there's a variety of ages within that grade. Likewise, if you look at, just all 6-year-olds, 0 months, 1 month, what have you, there's going to be a variety of different grades there. And so I don't know that retention necessarily, or if a student has been retained, that all of a sudden one of those norm groups all of a sudden becomes a better one to look at. They just give you, again, different pieces of information. Very likely, unless the student's been retained multiple times, there's going to be students in the normative group in either the age group or the grade group that matches them. And what about when we're doing score comparisons between IQ and achievement? Does that, because I think that most of our IQ tests give age equivalent. I want to say maybe the WJ also allows for grade. But because we're comparing to age with the IQ, should we also be comparing to age with achievement? Or again, that's just different pieces of information?
If you're going to take that step and directly compare an IQ score to the achievement score, and I would only suggest you do that where the scores have been co-normed or there's some type of linking process done there. Then you want to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples. So you'd want to use the same normative group. So you'd either use grade norms for both the IQ and achievement, or you'd use the age norms for both IQ and achievement. Now, typically, IQ has been defined as according to same age peers as opposed to same grade peers. But theoretically, there's nothing prohibiting you from looking at same grade when calculating, IQ. It's just that when you go to write that up or go to interpret that, you're going to be very explicit that you use grade norms to calculate, the cognitive scores, as opposed to the age score. So it really doesn't matter which one you use. You just have to be consistent and use the same norm group for both the IQ and achievement.
Gotcha. That makes sense as to, if they're co-norm, that would for sure be better. What about, I know, that's ideal to use, the WJ cog and the WJ achievement, or the WISC and the Wyatt type of thing. I, however, don't see that a lot in practice, at least in my district and reports that come to me. I generally see, a WISC and a WJ, or, that type of thing. So I guess you're saying that's not best practice. And then would that requirement for them to be apples to apples, does that still hold, or is that kind of a moot point, being that we're already comparing apples to oranges with WISC and WJ? Does that make sense?
It makes sense. So the issue there is what type of comparison do you want to do? If you want to do a qualitative comparison, you just want to say, oh, they're average on cognitive ability, they're below average on academic achievement. It really doesn't make a difference. You know, you can use the Wechsler for the cognitive, Woodcock-Johnson for achievement, or use the Koppen for the, cognitive, and use, some key math or whatever for achievement. Really doesn't make a whole lot of difference if all you're doing is what I'm going to call qualitative, comparisons there. And they're saying that, oh, they're average or above average on the cognitive, they're below, average on the achievement, and you just call it a day there. The problem comes when you say that, oh, they had a 112 on the WISC-5 and they had an 84 on the, Woodcock-Johnson 4. Oh, look, there's a 20 some odd point difference there. That's where the problem comes in, because that 20 points has no meaning at that point. You can try to see if you can do that comparison. A colleague and I, Sean McLaughlin, wrote a paper for Applied Neuropsych talking about how you can, we didn't use the term linking, but how you can compare scores with different norm groups. You get basically it's using regression. So if the technical manuals have given you the correlations between the different instruments, and they've kind of given you what the means and standard deviations are in those, in the samples where they've given both, let's say, the Woodcock-Johnson and the WISC, then you can calculate what the expected score on the Woodcock-Johnson should be given a score on the WISC. That's a very rough form of linking or equating the scores. It's not like the high-tech version that you get with some of the educational measurement instruments, but it's a rough form of doing that linking there, and that'll allow you to kind of make more of a quantitative comparison. You could say, oh, that the 100 on the WISC is equivalent to, like, say, a 95 on the Woodcock-Johnson. Then you have to take into that account that they have different locations, and then you can do a bit more quantitative type of comparison there.
Gotcha. So when I was in North Carolina, for example, they my district had like a 15-point discrepancy was the criteria for LD. So that's probably not ideal. I mean, using those regression tables in the manuals would probably have been, I mean, not that I'm going to change North Carolina's, how they do things, but that's probably not super psychometrically sound, correct?
Yes, unless there's been some empirical evidence linking the scores together, you're putting a whole lot. You have a huge amount of assumptions going into comparing those, and even more than that, saying that, oh, the 15-point difference or whatever point difference is meaningful, because you don't know, because if you look at temperature, like from a Kelvin to a centigrade, those units are not equivalent. They're getting at the same attribute, but the units are not equivalent. You have a very similar situation if you're using the WISC and the Woodcock-Johnson. Unless you have some way to link those scores, you have no idea whether those units are actually comparable or not. So a 15-point difference could be meaningless, or it could be it's a huge amount of difference in the attributes. You just don't know unless there's been some type of empirical evidence to show, given their score on this instrument, what do you expect them to get on another instrument?
Okay, awesome. That's a great analogy, and I feel like that kind of cleared some of that up for me. So there isn't really a way to compare, like, say, they got this score on the key math and this score on the WJ. There isn't a way to figure out, are those different? Are they the same? If we don't have those tables or that research, right? It's totally
quantitatively correct. Qualitatively, you could say they're both in the average range, they're both below average, et cetera. But if you want, there's no way to directly compare those values. And that's part of the problem with psychological measurement, is that, this traces history back to Thorndike and Woodsworth there, that they said, oh, we want to combine these scores, and so we're going to make them look as if they're the same, units there by having those mean deviation, standard deviation scores, but they're really not directly comparable in many instances.
Okay. And then my other question is, like, why we taught this in grad school? Like, I feel like the more I'm in this field, the more I'm like, oh, that was wrong. I was taught that and that was wrong. Like, to me, in my stats class, like, I don't think I recall anyone saying, hey, you can't really, like, don't do that. Okay, that kills me, but.
I mean, could they look on the surface like they're directly comparable because they're in the same, quote unquote IQ units or T-score units or standard score units, et cetera there. So on the face of it, they look like they're directly comparable, except for the fact that they're not. I mean, they're directly comparable that you can say that, oh, an 85 on the Kaufman is a standard deviation below the mean. An 85 on the Woodcock-Johnson is a standard deviation below the mean. So in that sense, they're comparable. But you cannot say that an 85 on the Kaufman has the same level of attribute as an 85 on the Woodcock-Johnson. Okay. That's where the problem arises, is not necessarily in the numbers, but in the that next step of inference of saying that, oh, well, this in 85 means the same level of the attribute across the instruments. And that's where psychology has fallen down for the last 100 years. They've not mapped their numbers onto levels of the attribute well at all. There are some exceptions to that rule, but for the most part, we've not. And part of that's due to just kind of taking Stephen's word as, being gospel, that, oh, he said you can basically by fiat, determine, the properties of an instrument and give whatever units you want to instruments without doing the work behind that and figuring out what is this attribute. Does it make sense to actually put numbers to the attribute? And if so, what numbers should be placed there?
Okay. Super interesting. I'm sorry to derail you from your.
Oh, no. I really, I mean, I talk about that in class all the time, but, I'm teaching a measurement class in the spring, and we have a couple weeks on, the issues with Stevens. In fact, Stevens' whole definition where he came up with measurement, it was a backlash because the British Association for the Advancement of Science basically just censured him for, not doing a very good job with his Sohn scale and saying that, oh, well, you really aren't measuring things, so you're giving numbers, but it's not really measurement. And he was abhorrent. I mean, he just thought that was a horrible thing that they would call him out on that. So much of his stuff on measurement was a backlash to the British folks calling him out, for that. And so for whatever reason, the American psychologists largely ignored the precursor to Stevens's definition, and they've just kind of taken his definition as gospel.
Oh, interesting. Sure. Okay. I'm looking at time, and what do you want to do? Do you want to go a little bit and hit on a couple more concepts in your PowerPoint, or do you want to talk about some of the other stuff that we wanted to get to?
Are there some questions? I mean, if there are other questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, I have other things.
I don't think that there's questions that have come in, but I have my own questions because you know that I come nerdily prepared for these things.
Go for it.
Just some of the things that we see on a regular basis posted in social media, because I see the same questions posted again and again on Facebook and Twitter and whatnot, and so I'm thinking that there are kind of things that people don't have a strong understanding of, or there's some confusion about. So can you talk, a lot of times I see people say, oh, I've got, a 60 and I've got all these index scores of 60 and 63 and 64. And then my composite score is a 52. Like, why are my indices higher than my composite score? Like, shouldn't that be an average? So what's the reasoning for that?
It's a little bit long story there. Before I say anything, I'll say that Joel Schneider has written a very nice little technical manual. I think it's for the Woodcock-Johnson on that, and it's on his website. It's freely available, and you can go check that for the details there. Part of the long and short of it is that there's different standard deviations with the composite score than there are with the instrument scores going into that composite. And because all of these scores in psychology are norm reference, the majority of them are norm reference scores. And so norm reference meaning that the unit, or not the units, but the values are going to be in reference to not only the average, but also the standard deviation. Because the standard deviation changes, the standard deviation tends to be, a bit larger in the individual scores than they are in the composite scores. That's the large reason why you get differences there, is because the standard deviations are different. And so if you have, a 5 unit, so if the average is 100 and you have a, score of 105, well, if your standard deviation is 15, that's going to look a lot different than if it's, a standard deviation of 10 or standard deviation of 5. So when that standard deviation shrink, which tends to happen with the composite score, the standard deviation tends to shrink. It means that you're going to have more extreme values for a given, number of for a given deviation from the mean, if the standard deviation is smaller, it means that score is going to look more extreme. So that tends to be what happens with composite scores looking more extreme than had been expected, is because the standard deviation there is a lot smaller. And all these scores in psychology are based on standard deviation units. So the standard deviation changes, and so therefore the score looks more extreme, for a composite than the scores that compose the composite.
All right, sounds good. And then I'm just going to go down my list unless somebody chimes in and has others. But I definitely want to hear what you also what you feel are questions that come up periodically in the field. But Flynn effect. I think we all know, what the Flynn effect is, and we're concerned with maybe instruments that are getting a little bit older. So I'm thinking about the DOS2 at like 13 years and the SP5 at like 15 years. Should we be concerned about that, or, at what point do you stop using a test?
That's two different things there. When you stop using a test, that's a very interesting question. And APA has completely just said it's up to clinicians. If you look at their ethics code, they write it quite nebulously, and they basically say it's really up to clinicians to decide, A, when a test becomes too old, and B, when a new instrument comes out, when to switch over to the new instrument. They kind of leave it at the discretion of the clinicians within some reason. I mean, if a new instrument, a new edition comes out, and 20 years later you're still using the previous one, that probably goes a little bit beyond clinical discretion. But for the most part, APA just kind of leaves it up to clinicians, and NASP for the most part does as well. And most state guidelines follow APA or NASP. So really it's kind of up to clinical discretion about when a test becomes too old. Now, does the Flynn effect play a component? Most likely. The Flynn effect is one of those things where we kind of have quasi laws that we kind of somewhat can predict what's going to happen, as IQ scores, change, or, as individuals gets compared to older and older, more obsolete norms. They're not quite laws, because sometimes you get, scores higher than expected, so I can't say it's a law in that this always happens, but they're quasi laws. But we have laws without a really good theory about why it's happening. So, typically, the stages of science is that you have these observations and you develop laws. Then from the laws, you kind of come up with these, theories. We really don't have a very good theory that explains the Flynn effect. We have lots of different hypotheses, nutrition or, changes in the education environment, media, to have all these different theories trying to explain these quasi laws, but really don't have a very good theory that kind of incorporates all of what we see with these score changes. And so, yes, the Flynn effect is probably, contributing to score differences. So if you're using the DOS2 now, the scores are probably a bit inflated. How much they're inflated, I don't know. If you read the Flynn effect literature, let's say it's about 0.3 IQ points a year. Again, that's a very rough average. So I can't say that universally applies to every instrument. So the DOS2, is probably inflated. I don't think that the DOS2, or I don't think that the DOS3 is, I don't know if it's going to happen or not. I've heard different things there. The Stanford Binet, I know the 6th edition is in progress. We just had Gail Roy here at Baylor a few weeks ago, and the 6th edition is being developed as we speak. So that should be out, within a few years. But even with Stanford Binet 5, we're using it now. The scores there are probably also a little bit inflated. But I can't tell you how much. That's the problem, is that we kind of have these quasi laws that you can probably say that the scores are inflated, but we really don't know by how much. And so until we get a better understanding about what the Flynn effect is, and we have a good theory that, can explain it, we're just kind of at the stage now where we just say that it's a quasi law that the Flynn effect, exists, but we really can't, predict its exact nature or its exact effect. And we really can't explain why it happens. So we really can't control for it.
I have a question about norm sampling. It dawned on me a while ago that when a test, uses their norm sample, standardizes their test, they obviously don't have you know, 1,000 students in grade 2 with a representative sample of, you know, the United States, you know, every, you know, 100 students at grade 2.1, 100 students at grade 2.2, 100 students at grade 2.3, and so on across, you know, kindergarten through 12th grade. So are they looking at averages and then projecting across grade levels? How does that work, you know, when creating the norm sample?
Yes, they typically try to get, you know, X number of students within these particular ranges. And whether they do it by, you know, ages or grades or what have you, they try to get, you know, a number of students, you know, in there, and then they try to figure out, well, kind of where's their plateaus in there. So, you know, let's say that, you know, kindergarten, you know, first month to kindergarten, third month, there seems to be very little difference. So we'll call that, you know, a group. Then kindergarten, maybe third month to fifth month, whatever, there's very little difference, you know, there. And so you're right, they're not getting oodles of students in there. So part of that's going to be constrained by how much variability is there within scores, and part of it is how many folks do we actually have in this you know, particular grade level. So, you know, I think if you look at the the Pfeiffer assessment of reading and math, there's very few folks within those particular grade levels. It's just hard. I mean, it's extremely hard to get a national representative sample, you know, within you know, that are, you know, representative as far as, you know, age, race, you know, SES, sex, you know, all these different demographic characteristics that we want to map onto a national sample. It's very hard. It's very expensive to get, you know, folks, you know, in there. And so part of those, you know, norms are based on, you know, how many folks they actually are able to gather. And then as well as, you know, where does development, you know, tend to, you know, change versus, you know, plateau a bit there. So, you know, what kind of determines what those sample sizes are there? It's a mixture of factors, mixture of, you know, a theory of the attribute change, as well as just resources available.
Okay. So let's say, you know, thinking of the Pfeiffer assessment of reading, which I use, should we be more skeptical of tests that have smaller norm samples?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if the goal is to say, you know, Susie's performance compared to, you know, her quote unquote same age, or in the Pfeiffer, the same grade, you know, peers. Well, if we're going to say same grade, then you really want to know what a typical performance looks like, you know, for this particular grade across the U.S. You know, so if you're wanting to have a normative comparison, then yes, if the sampling of the norming sample is not very representative or is, you know, quite small, then yes, there should be a lot of caution involved in interpreting that. Now, if you look at it from more of a functional perspective, you can say that, oh, well, they can do this particular operation, then that's really the norming sample really doesn't have that much of an influence there. But if you wanted to make national comparisons, then yes, the norming sample makes a huge amount of difference.
How big of a sample? I mean, and it's probably a hard question to ask, like how large the sample can be. But I feel like we talked to somebody, and I don't know if it was on air or off air, and it might have been Dr. Reynolds, who said that, you know, there comes a point where you don't need to go any bigger, that it's just kind of for show almost. Does that make sense? Or is
no, it does. I mean, if you look at you know, polling for, you know, opinion polls like, you know, Gallup or whatever, they don't typically have large sample sizes. The idea is that you want to get a sample size that maps onto getting the standard error where you want it to be. So typically the sample size is selected. Ideally, it would be to get the standard error to be as small as you wanted it to be. You know, because, you know, at some point, if you have, you know, 200 versus 250, the standard error really doesn't change that much. No, but you know, 25 versus 75, the standard error shrinks quite a bit. You know, so it depends on how large you want that standard error, or how large you want the confidence intervals, you know, to be there. And that just kind of depends on, you know, what you expect the score variability to be, and how much, you know, variance you think that, you know, the attribute actually has within these, you know, particular age categories or grade categories there. So, but typically the sample size, part of the decision there is getting a standard error of a certain size.
Very cool.
So that's why Gallup can make these huge, and as we can see, not always correct, but these huge, you know, extrapolations based on relatively small samples, because, you know, they, first of all, they do a random sampling, and second of all, they figured out this is the size we need to have a standard error of this small.
Interesting. So I'm going to go to my next question, if that's okay. DD criteria. Some states say, 30% in 2 or more areas, or some they give a percentage, 20% delay, 30% delay. How do you do that when you're getting standard scores? Like, how do you do a percent delay? Does that make any sense? I've seen people take the age equivalent and do 30% from that. I've seen people say, no, you have to use something like play-based assessment or a measure that gives, months. You get students performing at a 6-month level and they're 2 years old, and so you do a percent delay from that. How does that?
And actually, I mean, unless the state has codified that within their legal guidelines about this is what we're defining percent delay is, it just makes absolutely no sense to do that. I mean, we don't have I mean, I would say that most of our instruments are ordinal at best. We probably don't even have interval scale, but what they're asking kind of for there is more on the ratio level there, and it just makes no sense to talk about, oh, this is a 30% delay. How on earth would you be able to know what that is? I mean, that really kind of preclude or really presumes that you have some type of ratio, type of units. Or first of all, you have units, and then you have some type of ratio scale there, and we just don't have that for most psychological instruments there. So I mean, unless the states are going to codify that in their laws when they're talking about a particular percent delay, you're going to see oodles and oodles of variation across that, because there really is no way to do that well with what we have now.
Okay, that makes me feel better that I'm not crazy, because I always look at that and some states I know say 30% or 2 standard deviations and do it like that, and that makes more sense to me. But yeah, the states that just have the 30% thing doesn't.
Again, that's kind of where the disconnect is between the legal component versus the science component there. I'm sure from the legislator's perspective, there's some advocate or whatever telling them that it makes sense, but we're not physics and we don't have that type of precision yet in our measurements.
Mm-hmm. And anybody watching to check out the first part 1 of the stats where talking about the ordinal and interval scales and whatnot. So that was then you hit on that again. That's a big one. Okay, and then I think I've got another question. The WISC norms and the digital, the iPads. I think that it was. How does that work? Because I know that they didn't necessarily do a full normative sample with the digital administration. Is there concerns for that?
There's concerns in that they're wanting to say that the paper and pencil scores are fully exchangeable with the digital scores. Now, if they just want to say that we have a digital version, we have a paper and pencil version, they both give you values, but it's like, Form A versus Form B. They're not the exact same thing. And so, treat them as being independent instruments. Treat them like you would have like the WISC-5 and the WISC-5B. They're 2 separate instruments that are both, assessing similar attributes. That's fine. Nothing wrong there. But when they say that, oh, the digital administration 100 there means the exact same thing as 100 on the paper and pencil administration, that requires a very strong type of evidence. If you look in the educational measurement literature, they talk about equating scores and all that's involved in making the argument that 2 scores are exchangeable. And as far as I know, and this is just based on, because they have no peer-reviewed research that has investigated this. At least from the psych corner. In fact, I don't think anything on Google Scholar is up there yet that's looked at this. Pearson does have a couple of technical reports online, but only thing that they tell you in the technical reports are average differences, and average differences really don't quite cut it. It's very akin to when you're looking at diagnostic situation. You say, oh, that there's an average difference in scores between these 2 groups. That's not sufficient. What you want to look at is like the sensitivity and specificity. Treat and McCall kind of talked about this, about 20 some odd years ago when you're looking at utility of an instrument. So you don't want to see are there average differences, but do the scores actually able to classify individuals, into the right categories based on the score. So very similar with the digital versus paper and pencil administration. Pearson makes the argument that on average, the score differences are relatively small for most of those subtests, but that doesn't is not sufficient, because you could have situations where, you know, some folks that 6 or 7 points, you know, higher on one versus the other, and some folks that are 6 or 7 points lower on one than the other, then they kind of cancel each other out in the aggregate. And so until, you know, Pearson actually does some type of equating, you know, studies where they actually look to see, you know, what you want to find is that, you know, the equating function to go from paper and pencil to digital is basically 1. That meaning that you don't really need to change the values until they can provide that type of evidence. I would say that the jury is very much out about whether those scores are exchangeable. In fact, I'd say the default state should be that they're not exchangeable until they can be proven otherwise. So if someone needs a dissertation or thesis project, best of my knowledge, there's not a lick of things published out by folks that don't have a conflict of interest there. So that would be, I can almost guarantee it would get published somewhere if you were to do that. So anybody that needs a project to do, there you go.
Yeah.
And I think that's super important that people start to do that and are doing that type of research, because we just, you know, all of our knowledge seems to come from Pearson or who's ever, you know, publishing the test, and we don't have that much to go on. And it's kind of disappointing as a practitioner that most of us practitioners just say, okay, you know, here's the new test, and go off and give it, and don't have a clue about what kind of goes on behind the scenes. And that whole thing last time about the interval and the ordinal scales, that maybe we can't be comparing these numbers at all. And that's, of course, concern.
And then you have the added issue there about, you know, the conflicts of interest, you know, there that Pearson wants to sell a product very similar. I used to work in a mental health inpatient unit a long time ago, and we had all these pharmaceutical reps that would come in and give, you know, Paxil balloons and pillows or whatever. I mean, they're trying to sell a product, you know. I mean, I don't want to say that necessarily were lying to you, saying that that the medicine is doing something that it couldn't actually do, but their job was to sell you something. They needed to make a, you know, a quota. The people at Pearson, they're trying to sell you something. They need to make these quotas there. And so they're going to have a conflict of interest. I can almost guarantee you that nothing's going to come out of Pearson that's going to say anything negative about any of the instruments, you know, that they're selling. And so what you basically kind of get is this file drawer effect. Whenever you have conflict of interest, that anything that doesn't quite show what they want it to show, it's kind of going to get buried, and it's not going to see the light of day there. And so only thing you're going to see on the website are things that are salutatory for, you know, their instruments. And so you're exactly right. We need, you know, folks without conflicts of interest to do this type of research to say, are these scores actually exchangeable or not?
Mm-hmm. Sure. All right. I know I most of my questions took up a whole lot of time, but is there anything else that before we wrap up that you want to hit on, either from your PowerPoint or just from things that you think that practitioners maybe watching this should know about their scores and our daily kind of practices, if we're kind of forgetting about our stats class? And maybe we need to forget about our stats class if they're giving us not super good information. But anything you want to, any words of wisdom on?
About the you know, I guess the main point here, and some of the stuff in the slides, I'll give you the slides that can be on, you know, on the site there, if you don't go over this, but is not to reify the values from these instruments, not to think that they actually have more meaning than they actually do. We kind of get accustomed in our math class to thinking that, you know, a value of 100 has certain properties, that it's twice the amount of 50, you know, that, you know, that 100 to 105 is the same amount of distance as 110 is to 115. We kind of have these understandings about numbers, and then we think that they automatically apply to the scores from our instruments. And they don't necessarily. It's up to the test developers, the test publishers, to give you the information about whether those numbers actually have properties that we're wanting them to have, or they're telling you that they have. You know, whether the scores lend themselves to making profiles or looking at you know, ipsative type of comparisons. It's up to the publishers to provide that information. If they don't provide that, don't assume that properties exist for those numbers simply because we're accustomed to numbers. And rely on, you know, empirical evidence, on you know, conceptual, you know, qualitative analysis of the attributes before you know, delving in or before making you know, interpretations that the numbers don't necessarily warrant. I think we're always going to be fine. Well, most of the time we're going to be fine with just saying an interval interpretation or qualitative interpretation is probably not going to, serve you wrong. To go much beyond that, there probably should be some type of evidence where you can say, if you're called to a due process hearing or something else, you'd say that, oh yes, this is the evidence I used to make the, decision, that these score differences actually had meaning to them. In the psychometric world, that's called reification, that you're putting, information or you're putting, meaning into numbers that don't actually exist. So try to, don't try to reify things until there's sufficient evidence. I call it in my class premature reification. Don't do that premature reification there. Wait until there's evidence before you say that, oh yes, these numbers actually map onto an attribute, or these numbers actually does make sense for us to look at score differences with them.
That's helpful. That's really great. I've been checking for anybody's last minute questions or comments out there. So this is your absolute last chance if you're listening and you have a thought or question for us. And just to remind everyone, we will be back next on December 16th with Heidi McDonald, who is going to talk about a school psychologist's words to live by. Especially helpful for early career folks or people just entering the field. So we hope you'll join us then.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for coming on tonight and for a second episode too. So we appreciate it. It's awesome.
Thank you for having me again. I very much enjoy this and enjoy the podcast that you all are producing. It's very, very quality work.
Thank you so much.
It's a great discussion. We appreciate your thoughts.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night, all.
Bye.